When I was in my mid-teens, one of the family friends' older sons, who was then sort of going into these university years, took a gap year. And in the gap year, he went to Japan. And he came back and told the story of Japan, which then would have been sort of, the late 80s, early 90s. And, how amazing things were and how sort of just exotic and different and exciting it was. And that really planted a seed in my head, which created profound change through my life. And I think if you look at it, every major change that we've ever taken in our lives has at some point been traced upstream to a story somebody told us, which impacted us, which created change later on. And it may not have been any kind of overt statement like you should go to Japan. It was just sort of painting the possibility of what life could be like and then just spiking our curiosity. So storytelling in Asia. If you look at Asia now, we're in a very interesting space. This is the beginning of the Asian century. And, we've just done a podcast with McKinsey on the Future of Asia report, which is all about how Asia really is, the de facto market now for consumers and innovation globally. And we sort of changed. I mean, if you look at the last 100 years, this was sort of the American century where, America dominated both as a producer and a consumer of products globally. But now if you look at Asia, 2/3 of the world's middle class will be living in Asia by 2030. And the value of that market would be $30 trillion, which is about twice the size of the US economy today. So we've gone from the situation where Asia was the factory of the West, producing T-shirts and sneakers for American consumers, to now being their own consumer market. And now you're seeing this Asia to Asia trade going on. So you have the situation where Asia now does more trade with itself than it does with the rest of the world. Add to that, you have this unique geographical structure of Asia, which is a lot of people in a very small area, effectively. If you were to fly here from Singapore or Kuala Lumpur, for example, where our client AirAsia is based, within a 5-hour radius, you could reach half the world's population. That's 3.5 billion people. A 5-hour flight will get you half the world's population. If you were to compare that to a startup or a brand in Silicon Valley, flying from SFO airport, you would reach 700 million, which is a fifth, 20% of the size of the market you could reach logistically, tactically from here from a place like Kuala Lumpur. So what that then means is that the competition is so extreme here in Asia that because the premiums and the rewards are so high, that the speed of evolution, digital transformation, is happening at 5 times the pace. So if you want to understand the future of travel, don't go to Silicon Valley, go to Kuala Lumpur and AirAsia, because that is ground zero of hyper competition, where the speed of competition and evolution is so fast that the answer will be reached faster, because it's like a gladiatorial arena where brands are just duking it out until the winner emerges. You will know that the winner from that battle will be the toughest, strongest of all the competitors. So that's what's happening in Asia. You've got this massive middle class, and then you've got this hyper competition layered on top, which means that the solutions for this middle class will be much more robust than anywhere else in the world. And that is why in most parts we're seeing brands like AirAsia, and then you've got the Alibabas and the Didis and the Chinese platforms coming out, which are so much more advanced than their Western competitors. If you were to compare, for example, like Grab, Gojek and Uber being the ride-sharing platform, the original from the US. Now, Uber and Uber Eats are 2 separate apps, whereas Grab, even like Gojek, has like 11 or 12 different functions, which I talk about in this podcast, everything from, getting your laundry done and so on. Their evolution is happening much, much faster. So the hyper competition is much stronger here, that therefore they're forced to evolve at a lightning speed. Add to this as well, the final part, and this is where podcasts come in, is that for these 3.5 billion middle classes emerging They've gone from like 900 million to 3.5 billion in 20 years. So for those, there is a massive storytelling gap, which is that they're not buying the washing powders or using the insurance companies or even working for the coveted blue chip brands that their parents once respected, because the Asian parents here weren't middle class consumers, so they had no legacy. Whereas in the West, there are legacy brands and legacy employers and legacy schools. Therefore, kids learn from their parents what's good and what's not. Here, there's no starting point. So therefore, a bank could do that. Or why not a taxi company be a bank? Or healthcare could be an insurance company. Those rules can get written because there's no starting point like there is in the West, where that's what that company has done. And, it's been making beans since like 1886. Therefore, it's always going to make beans. Whereas here in Asia, it's like, well, okay, I've solved your beans problem. Now, like, what about, healthcare? It's sometimes as diverse as that. If you've got that problem and I've got a relationship with you, then I have your payment details as well. Then why not I solve other problems that you have? So you have this massive emergence of platforms on one side, which are very much market focused as opposed to mission focused. It's like just solve every problem that you have rather than just be really good at solving one problem like Uber. And if you were also to compare like WhatsApp owned by Facebook and WeChat by comparison owned by Tencent, the differences are phenomenal. Like, WhatsApp's hardly evolved in 10 years, whereas WeChat is like, you can renew your passport on that thing now. Add to this, you have these consumers who are without any legacy. You've got this massive storytelling gap to be filled. By who and how? And this is where I want to position podcasts as one part of that solution. You have a huge storytelling gap here in Asia. And people may say, well, Asians don't podcast. Well, quite the contrary. I mean, the Chinese podcast market is very developed. And there's a lot of interesting use cases coming out of that. I talk about it in Asia Tech podcast just recently about dating and podcasts for young Chinese. And that market has evolved very fast and very rapidly because again, there's no legacy. It's not like this is how it needs to be. This is how record labels behave. This is licensing and so on. It's almost starting from zero and saying like, okay, so customers have this problem. Let's build a solution around that. And we don't care. It doesn't look like what you had 10, 20 years ago, and therefore it doesn't fit in. It just does the job. So we have China on the one hand, and then you also have Korea. So 52% of Koreans have listened to podcasts according to the Infinite Dial research that came out recently. That is the highest level of podcast consumption in the world. So anybody that says Asians don't listen to podcasts hasn't been to Asia. That is gone. Maybe 10 years ago, yeah. But now these are the most advanced markets in the world. Sure, they don't have that sort of mainstream mass content like the Joe Rogans or the NPRs, This American Life, that is globally transferable. But that may change. Himalaya is a $100 million backed platform owned by Himalaya, a Chinese company. And you have brands like Castbox coming out who are well-funded Chinese platforms. So it is going to change, and it will change here in Asia first. And you're going to see podcasts fulfill that storytelling gap because there is no resistance from the public. It just takes a little bit of education. But once they're on board, they're on board. And as we see, if you can convince young females to get on board with podcasting, the rest works itself out. As with all technologies, if it's the young females that adopt it, then you've broken through many of the barriers which are then translatable to other sections of the market. Mobile phones, text messaging being a good example. That started with young girls. So if we can see that pattern replicate in podcasting, then that's a good sign. And we're seeing that. We're seeing young women consume, for example, true crime podcasts, and they love them. These are some of the heaviest consumers of these podcasts. And what it says is that if that works, that's going to propagate throughout the market. The consumer barriers to usage are low after young females. Here in Asia, we have the second part of the change, which is these platforms, which I've mentioned. They don't have huge legacies of advertising. So whether it's Alibaba, Didi, or Grab, AirAsia, Gojek, they're not big advertisers like the consumer products companies. They do advertise, but as a percentage of their revenues, it's quite low. And therefore, their problem is a little bit different, which is that they have all the data about their customers. So why waste their money blasting people they don't know when they have lots of data on people they do know? Where they should be blasting their money is on them. And rather than advertise them, which is obviously, a channel which is aimed at just random people, like, bus billboards and TVs and even on Facebook. Rather than that, you've got their payment details. They're part of your platform. The key now is not necessarily finding customers for your products, but finding products for your customers. So how do you do that? You have to build this community, this partnership community, which is really now about creating a tribe. And that goes back to how do you do that? Using podcasts to create community, which is the challenge of humanizing your brand. Because at the end of the day, that community is what differentiates platform A and platform B. There's nothing else in it now apart from the community that they have. So the challenge for these platforms is, how do they create communities? And podcasting is a really powerful way of doing that. Not necessarily replacing the events and the outreach that they do, but helping augment it. The third challenge here in Asia is, I believe Asia is internationalizing faster than anywhere else in the world. Geographically, obviously, it's a vast continent, 4.5 billion people. And add to that many, many different languages and many, many different cultures. And, a lot of dynamic tensions here. Yet add to that, you've got a lot of people coming to Asia for different reasons. So I read recently that there are more Indians studying in China, in Chinese universities, than they're studying in the UK, which is an interesting flip. If you think about that, traditionally, if you were Indian, of a family in India, middle class, you would send your kids to the UK. And that still happens, but now it's going the other way, which is they're sending their kids to China. So that's a huge internationalization. It doesn't involve the UK and it doesn't involve the US. You have a lot of people coming to places like here in Singapore because it's a huge vantage point into these markets of 4.5 billion. And, like I said, just now, the 5-hour flight radius gets you huge access. So it's a good reason for people to come here, especially if you're an entrepreneur, especially if you're a startup founder and so on. And we're seeing a lot of neobanks coming to Singapore because it's a great place for fintechs. It's a great place to get into those Asian middle classes. And, they don't have to play by the rules necessarily that their competitors play by, which is, they can be a lot more agile. They can respond to where the markets are and they can come in at different angles. Then you have also these projects like the Greater Bay in China, where you have potentially one of the largest cities in the world forming of 60 million people, which will be, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Suzhou, and all those sort of, Shenzhen satellite cities joined together in this one massive project and all joined by this infrastructure. And what that means basically is there's going to be a lot of talent coming from outside China into China for the first time. Then you have Tokyo 2020, the Olympics, a lot of English-speaking or non-Japanese speaking tourists coming to Japan for the first time, and a lot of people coming with money looking for experiences. They don't want to just come for the Olympics. They want to go and experience that whiskey distillery on that island or go spearfishing somewhere off Japan. They want to experience all of that, and they have money. Yet all the money is going into Tokyo right now, and therefore, you look at the central government in Tokyo is pushing a lot of money out into the provinces to get these people to bring non-Japanese people into the regions, because they just don't know. I mean, why the hell would I go to Fukuoka? I don't know what it's about. I know Fukuoka reasonably well, and I love Fukuoka as a city. It's got some of the best food in Japan, often called unofficially the food capital of Japan. If you're a foodie, Japan's a great place, and Fukuoka is, within Japan, one of the best places. So people don't know that. They know Tokyo, and they might know Osaka or Hiroshima or Kobe or Kyoto, obviously, but that's it. So you have this huge internationalization going on in Asia at the moment, which means that you need to communicate to people who are not of your world this change. So you need to tell non-Japanese people about what's great in Fukuoka. You need to tell people about what's great in the Greater Bay and why you should set up your startup in the Greater Bay as opposed to San Francisco Bay. You need to tell people why you, Didi, this massive faceless platform, is a great place to work, or a great team to partner with, or great people to buy from. And there are no brand legacies to work from here. People don't know Fukuoka, they don't know the Greater Bay, and they don't know who the hell Didi are. You have these 3.5 billion middle class locally, but add to that, you've got the other billions outside Asia coming into Asia for the first time. This is the huge storytelling gap that I feel that podcast can plug, because it's a very effective way of communicating stories. Imagine if you were sitting in a plane flying to Fukuoka and you're listening to this podcast about local experiences, and you hear somebody talking about a travel experience going to this distillery, this whiskey distillery. Now, if that was done in a very authentic way as opposed to like a travel guide, those sort of slick videos that feel very superficial and don't really give you anything, that would be great. I would get that. Or if you heard stories about people moving to the Greater Bay and setting up businesses there, and I lived in San Francisco, I'm only going to believe that if I believe those stories are real. If they're actors, if they're influencers, quote unquote, if they're staged, if they're paid for, if it's a slick PR video by the Greater Bay Development Authority, I'm not going to buy it. I understand what the game is. I understand, like, just because you got money that you can pay for this stuff and do a good video. It kind of impresses me, but it doesn't get me to take action. It's when you tell me as a human story, just like that story that influenced me to make change in my life and go and move to Japan. That's how you're going to get people to get on board. That's how you can tell the stories in human, authentic ways. And the only way to do that is give those people a voice. It ain't going to come from the Greater Bay Development Authority. But if the Greater Bay Development Authority empowered local entrepreneurs, foreign entrepreneurs, to tell their stories, the humans of the Greater Bay, that would be powerful. And that is the storytelling gap that I believe podcasts can fill here in Asia.